In this episode, we're taking a look at 3 decades, and we're trying to decide what was the best era for music. Stay with us.
Get ready for the 3324 podcast, where lifelong friends Dean Legiro and Eric Kuber share their love of all things music and movies. Dean has directed short films and is a music trivia buff, and Eric, trained in audio engineering, brings his extensive knowledge of music and film to the conversation as they discuss, debate, and celebrate their favorite albums, films, and much more.
Welcome, friends, to the 3324 podcast. The journey continues.
Mm-hmm. Indeed it does.
The next generation. Right?
2023, yeah.
Season 1 was TOS, the original series.
Star Trek reference.
Season 2 is The Next Generation, and then Season 3 will be DS9. Right? And then Voyager?
Yeah. Voyager, Enterprise, yeah.
And then Enterprise.
And then whatever else is out
Disco.
there.
Disco.
Yeah.
Star Trek Disco.
Yeah. Right.
First season was great. They lost me after the first season of Discovery. So but that's an episode for another time. We haven't really done. We only ever talked about Star Trek 2. We never really.
I would love to do full on, just overall discussion of Trek through the years.
That would take 5 hours for overall.
No, but discussion. I'm just. I mean, it would actually. If we brought a couple more people on, I think it would be interesting.
If you're a Trekkie, I don't use the term Trekker, but a Trekkie, hit us up if you want to do a Star Trek episode.
Yeah.
And why the original series was the best out of all of them. So that will be the premise of the episode. Just to let you know now, just so you know what you get. So this isn't like a Copland episode.
Right.
Trek lovers only.
Mm-hmm.
But this episode, first of all, follow us on social media. We're going to be talking about, we're going to be picking 3 decades, and we're going to kind of look and we're just going to kind of have a discussion and talk about what, after we're done, see what we feel might be the best decade for music. So, and you can certainly let your thoughts be known on Instagram or Facebook at 3324 Podcast. You could join the conversation. We encourage you to join us and have some lively discussion and debate. It's always fun to hear other people's opinions, and I always learn something new too. We have such a group that is they are of the hive mind. When it comes to music and movie knowledge, there's stuff shooting from all different directions. Yeah. And it's great to read that stuff. So join us there, won't you, on Facebook. The group is very lively, and there's always room for more. We got plenty of seats available. So come on in, stop off at the concession stand, get some popcorn, and then join the group.
Yep. Absolutely.
Yep. Do you concur? I concur.
I wholeheartedly concur. That's it. Just a few words.
Do you concur? Yes, I concur. That's a Catch Me If You Can reference there.
Yeah.
So what we're going to do, what sparked this?
Yeah, I'm interested in knowing where the idea, the genesis of this.
Yeah, because this kind of came up pretty sudden. I kind of texted Eric. I'm like, hey, how about this? Mm-hmm. And it kind of sprang out from another idea. And it really came from the death of David Crosby. Kind of spurred this, and maybe the death of Jeff Beck and the death of Christine McVie.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Kind of started making me think that we're going to be in a very for music lovers, or especially if you love classic rock and you love music from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, we're going to be in a very difficult situation of losing these artists. That we've taken for granted, that have just always been there. Because they were there when we were young, and they've been there through our teen years and our 20s, and whether or not they were popular or not, or Jeff Beck or Crosby, Stills and Nash come and go, whatever it is, they're there, and you kind of take it for granted that they were there. So it got me thinking about the state of music.
Yeah, and
the genesis was, are there artists today that have that reverence? Or even bands from the 90s that they'd be aged in 30 years now, right? If you came up in the 90s, are there bands from the 90s that have any of that reverence? And then it got me to think of, well, then really, where was some of the greatest music made, or what was probably the finest decade for music? So really kind of, it started off a little bit morbid about the passing of these artists and lamenting that we're going to be seeing, unfortunately, more of this, as these classic artists get older. So I took it from lamenting it to kind of thinking about, well, what might have been the greatest era, and this is going to be speculation. We're just going to kind of talk about it.
Yeah.
And we'll kind of go through, I figured we would talk about each decade and kind of approach it from the standpoint of, what was maybe some groundbreaking technology or techniques, high watermarks, perhaps, maybe some songs, I don't know, wherever we kind of go with it. And then we'll kind of go through each. So the 3 decades, it's going to be no surprise that I think we should talk about the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. I think those are the 3 prime candidates to have a lively debate about and to kind of really figure out from those 3.
Yeah, I definitely feel that. Well, a lot of the bands that are out there today, whoever's sort of like I think we kind of touched upon this several times actually in episodes where something, a lot of people out there today are doing the whole old is new again thing, calling back to a very specific time. I mean, you have very specific bands that are doing a very sort of kitschy. Is it kitschy or is it something that they truly love doing? Like they pick a particular genre and they just do that. And it's, I find that there's a lot of that happening today. People are just sort of crossing over and just sort of, people are already covering new songs, songwriters, budding songwriters. Something comes to mind this week. Actually, Kelly actually brought up the fact that there's a country artist that Kelly Clarkson did a cover on her show, and it just kind of blew up all over the internet. Like her version of this thing that she does, the karaoke thing on her show.
Yeah. Yep.
This was like really hot. Billie Eilish had done this song as well. And I think she actually prompted Kelly Clarkson because she's going through a rough patch right now, divorce wise and all that. So it's, so you got that kind of thing happening today where it's just this sort of bleed of people just coming together and just doing whatever. It doesn't feel like there's
but where are the superstar? Like, where are the
right? Yeah.
And we could have that. We could spend a whole episode just talking about the state, and I think that has to do with the state of the music industry as well.
Yeah.
And what the expectations are and what the buying public expects too. So, we have to, I guess, acknowledge that, that things are different now.
Yeah.
Than they were even in the 90s, even though we're not going to be talking about the 90s, but that was probably the last gasp for a traditional style of music distribution before the digital revolution began, and then people started consuming in a whole different way. So I think that kind of changed the notion of what an artist is.
Yeah.
And does the notion of a legacy artist even exist anymore? A lot of these artists from the 60s and 70s, they're still tour or their tribute, they trot out their greatest hits, but they're still doing it. And some of those are probably some of the biggest tours that are still making money. And then they'll have these quadruple bills, Styx, REO, Loverboy, and whoever, Cheap Trick, and they'll just and people will go see these artists still.
Stevie Nicks and Billy Joel.
Yeah, Stevie Nicks, Billy Joel. So there's weird. Still that. Yeah, it's still a vital thing, but so it got me thinking about that. I was like, well, what was apart from the obvious that the music has changed? What was so special or particular about those times? So I figured let's kind of start in the 60s, and we'll kind of go from there. And because I think the 50s was kind of. If you look at it, I was kind of looking at it as rock and roll or popular music as the lifespan of adulthood, right? So the 50s really were like the years from like 0 to 10, like of a baby, like kind of the growth. Rock and roll was kind of a new notion. It was feared. It was kind of coming up.
It was,
didn't know what was going on with it. And then once the 60s came in, that for me, I think I consider that like the teenage years.
Yeah.
of rock and roll, or if rock and roll was an adult, that would be like the teen. I think that would be like the
The
teen years.
the rebellious teenage years for sure.
Whatever,
Yeah.
the formative years
Yeah.
too, right?
Yeah.
So and that was the thing in one of the things that jumped out to me when I was kind of looking is, what kind of innovations were there
Mhm.
in the 60s. And I think one of the biggest ones was multi-track and stereo recording.
Mhm. Yeah.
I think that kind of change, that was kind of a game changer in the 60s for creating music, because in the 50s you would pretty much everybody would go in front of a microphone or a couple of microphones and just do everything live in one shot.
Yeah.
And you were basically recording you were capturing a performance.
A live performance.
Right.
Sure.
You were basically,
Yeah.
you weren't really recording it per se or recording a song. You were capturing a performance of a song,
Mhm.
that they kind of had to get basically in one take, meaning everybody, you do it till you got it right.
Yeah.
There really wasn't those sophisticated techniques. And I think in the 60s is really when that sophisticated recording technique started. And that really changed things.
Yeah. You had to, like the Honeymooners comes to mind, making the record, right?
Yeah, speaking into a microphone.
Speaking of, if you messed it up, that was it. You had to go get another record or whatever.
And go again.
And I'm sure these things weren't probably were not. I would imagine these were, like, at the time, were not cheap, to just to have to do that. But yeah, I mean, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the advent of multi-track recording really opened the door for even a 4-track. Like when the Beatles were doing, even with a 4-track, that was a big deal because they were able to spread it out, spread music onto, and I find that in itself fascinating because they were actually able to double loop certain sounds on one track. So you were able to capture more than one sound on one track.
Yeah, you'd bounce them over.
You could,
and you would
kind of bleed in.
Things. Yeah, you could stack things over on record.
Yeah.
Record, bass drums and vocals on 3 tracks, and then record all that over to 1 track, and then you'd have the other 3 tracks open to do other things. So it was a
seems like a lot of technique, a lot of work.
Exactly, a lot of experimentation to figure that out. To figure out, okay, is this something we can do, and what do you do with it, right? So it's not just that you've got it, but why would you do this?
Yeah.
And one of the innovations too I thought about was the wall of sound production.
Mm-hmm.
Right. That was kind of indicative of that, of Phil Spector, and his kind of wall of creating these layers of just of instruments, all kind of merging together into one big kind of panoramic painting of music that was just kind of behind the singers.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't do that without having some type of multi-tracking ability, besides having a whole bunch of people, a whole bunch of pros in the room recording stuff, but then also being able to overdub and add those things in.
Yeah, no doubt. But there were people like engineers, like I think it was the guy's name is Tom Dowd, who actually was one of the first people to actually use 8-track. He introduced it to Ray Charles, and that's how all those early recordings of Ray Charles were done. And this was at the same before or around the same time as what the Beatles were doing with the 4, and they never. I'm surprised. Like I think we've said this before, but I'm very surprised that George Martin didn't jump on that, because he had to have known that this was going on in America. But maybe, I don't know. Who knows?
I also think at the time too. I mean, again, rock and roll wasn't a serious, quote unquote, serious art form, so it didn't.
Yeah.
It didn't merit serious technique, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't until we've talked about this where the studio became another instrument.
Yeah.
To be learned.
Yeah.
And that's really what happened in the 60s is a lot of these artists became immersed or more interested in the creation of the music than in performing it live.
Right.
So that the innovation of well, we don't care. We don't necessarily have to be able to sing this and replicate it. We just want to create oral imagery, with our instruments and trying different things. And the 60s was kind of the proving ground for that.
Sure.
Even with a 4-track and getting really creative with that and pushing the boundaries of what you could do with the recording. And the Beatles, yeah, I mean, all you have to do is take the Beatles discography and listen to 2 songs from every other album. You don't have, and you'll
That's right.
see, you'll kind of like, you don't have to, you just start at the beginning, 2 songs, skip an album, 2 songs, and you'll see the growth and you'll see what was happening in music. That's a
Absolutely.
really easy way to do it.
And of course, one thing led to another. Influence, creates more influence, and you got, next thing you know, you have lush productions happening. You have, all of these, the psychedelic, coming in, and even people like Dylan, who were, just doing his acoustic guitar thing, his folk thing, would plug in,
Yeah.
become electric, and that, which was horrendous to certain people, because he was, obviously the politics of the day too was, but I think he had in mind as well that I want to move ahead too musically. I want to, innovate,
Yeah.
and not just be a voice with an acoustic guitar. That's, that time might have been passing me by. Now I'm ready to do more. I'm ready to experiment more.
Well, and he definitely sparked something. You make a good
Yeah.
point with protest songs, because that was a big part of the 60s.
Yeah.
In the beginning with folk music, rock and roll was kind of good time music, rock around the clock and blue
Yeah.
suede shoes. And then when before rock really exploded again in the 60s, it was that folk revival, Pete Seeger and Joan Baez and Bob Dylan talking about social issues
Mm-hmm.
and protest. And then that would be picked up again, like you said, with the psychedelic era, with bands like Jefferson Airplane,
Yeah.
and the Byrds and Buffalo Springfield, that notion of, we want to say something with this music as well.
Well,
And that was another thing of the 60s, was that, there was civil upheaval, and there was a war in Vietnam going on that these young people didn't want a part of.
Yeah.
How
And
can
now,
we, outside of going, but besides making signs and protesting, how else can we do it? And they were doing it with music in the 60s, which was
right.
another
And we didn't
kind
have
of
to,
high watermark.
they didn't have to keep it minimalist. They didn't have to keep it just, singing in a group of singers around a microphone. We could say something with the music. We could expand your mind and create. Now we can create textures and things like that to kind of help serve the emotion or what people were feeling of the day. Right. So sometimes it gets a little stagnant if it's just, one voice, maybe you want to create more, so I think that's what a lot of people had in mind. I would imagine, certainly Hendrix was with his message of love and, anti-war, but it was like, but he was doing it. You think of when he did the Star Spangled Banner at Woodstock, that was just, oh my God, people were like deathly afraid that the cops were going to like jump on stage and tear him off the stage. But that, good thing it didn't happen, but that was his way of looking at it, and way of sort of not necessarily anti-American, but it was just, he was opening the door for people to look at things differently.
Yeah, it was an interpretation of it, and
right.
And making it, I mean, doing the Star Spangled Banner, he wasn't doing it as an anti-American thing. He was doing it in tribute, but he was doing it in his way, and in the way that the youth could kind of, get behind. And I think of songs like "For What It's Worth" by Buffalo Springfield, right?
Yeah.
Of a classic protest song that was just trying to say something very simple, because everybody had, all the youth in the 60s had these high hopes, and that we can change the world with love, and they had high aspirations, and the music was following that. I don't know if the music was leading the way, possibly, with just the feeling that there was a movement going on in the 60s, and the music was kind of driving it. And it was kind of like the motor behind it, where these artists were really capturing what the feeling was. And so you had really socially conscious music coming from that era, besides the fun stuff, besides the British invasion, where once the Beatles hit, there was a wave of great pop music that followed it, of them trying to make a cookie cutter Beatles band, where all of a sudden it seemed like everybody looked like the Beatles, Jerry and the Pacemakers and Freddie and the Dreamers, and all these different bands were kind of flooded the U.S. and the music scene, because people couldn't get enough of it. So you have on one hand, you have got socially conscious stuff that would kind of really define the later 60s, but before that was kind of this poppy, happy stuff before things got psychedelic and
bubble
dark. It
gum.
was kind
Yeah.
of bubble gummy, but more innocent.
Yeah.
Where it was just kind of like, you know, the Beatles were seen as such a threat, but when you look back on it now, it's just like not really.
No, I don't. I wouldn't. No, I wouldn't say that at all.
And every
I mean,
band they spawned after that was just kind of even a lighter version of them.
and I'm sure a lot of these people would probably tell you, you know, I'm sure I don't know for sure, but this is just my opinion. But it's just I would think that no, we had something darker in mind when we wrote that bubblegum pop song. There was something more there that, you know, and some people figured that out, you know, as you're listening to it. It sounds innocent, but you know.
Yeah.
Well, it'd be a great example would be, wouldn't it be nice? I mean, that to me,
Yeah.
by the Beach Boys. I mean, it sounds like it's really, you know, a nice song, and it's like it's bright and bouncy, and it's but on the other hand, it's a cautionary tale, isn't it? I mean, it's like, yeah, you know, it's nice to think about these things, but you know, life isn't quite like that. You know, and Brian Wilson definitely had that in mind.
Yeah.
You know, when he wrote the music, and you know. Who's a Pete Asher that wrote the lyrics, right? I mean, it was
no, not Pete Asher. Why did you do that?
I don't know.
Pete, it's John Asher.
And we did
Pete Asher is
the producer, right? Yeah,
but associated with Paul McCartney. Paul McCartney went out with his sister. He was with Peter and Gordon.
My bad.
That's okay. Tony Asher.
Tony Asher.
It's not like we were there. We knew the guy, and we forgot
I know.
who he was.
But,
and so that whole that hopefulness with a little bit of reality sprinkled in.
Yeah.
You saw in '69, you know, Woodstock was a big gathering. It was kind of like a common, you know, hive mind of people that wanted to get together and have a festival. So all this great music was kind of coming out of it, you know, where the, you know, it wasn't all Beatles all the time. Like they were there, but there was all these other offshoots, you know, like the groups like the Byrds, which was taking a folk spin on things.
Yeah.
And kind of driving that. And then, like we talked about, we just did a Doors episode. those were a little some darker themes.
Well, definitely creating, but a very specific region too. That was the California sound, right? I mean, you know, a lot of this folky stuff came from there. You know,
the rise
San
of
Francisco,
Joni Mitchell.
You know,
all the hippie stuff.
All the hippie stuff, yeah.
You know, so much great. There was a lot of great music, and like I said, it just wasn't the Beatles and the Stones, you know, like the two of the biggest acts. There was so many other smaller bands, because it seems that once rock music got popular, everybody, if you had a band, like you could make a single, and if that single kind of caught on, you could have a contract, you know. So there was a lot of those one-hit wonders that really kind of came into the 60s. That kind of supplemented, you know, the other, you know, while the Beatles weren't having a number one, there was these other smaller groups that were kind of coming in, like the Rascals, and kind of having great careers of their own, and filling in what I, you know, when I think of the 60s, I think of bands. I don't just think of Beatles and Doors. I think of like the Rascals, and I just think of other great, mostly one-hit wonders, you know, like Hang On Sloopy and.
The Guess Who.
Guess Who had a massive string of hits.
Right. And they all made, you know, that's the thing. Like you mentioned contracts. So they all made albums. Like they were the strength of their were those one-hit wonders for the most part, but there was an album of material. And I think you'll find a lot of times too was not original material. They were covering Dylan, or they were covering, like they were doing their own protest songs, or you know, including that because that's what was popular at the time.
Yeah, it depended on your contract. You know,
right.
a lot of these bands would be assigned a producer.
Yeah.
Right. Because it was very much a business concern. So it's like, okay, we're going to sign you to a thing, and here's your producer. You know, Joe Smith is going to be your producer.
Yeah.
And you're going to cut, you know, this amount, you know, here, you know, re-record your hit and re-record a couple other ones, and then you're going to do, you know, there might have been a hit from last year and then they're going to cover that one, you know, just so there's familiar stuff on the record. So there really wasn't a lot of, you know, outside of the big bands like you know, Doors, Beatles, Stones, etc., who not a lot of autonomy, because they were kind of happy to have a recording contract, and kind of the record company was kind of for the most part, calling the
They were,
shots
yeah,
back
and
then.
I'm sure they were just happy to
Yeah,
have that, you know, I guess your day in the sun, so to speak, and that's what
yeah,
a lot of these bands that are still around do that. Like you think of like these rock and roll shows that they bring back all like several of these old people, and they're
yeah.
doing like, this sort of like vintage nostalgia thing, but
Yeah,
it's like, it's
they do their two hits and then they get trotted off and then
that's right.
I mean those are like the real old like the realness like they bring out all the one hit
Like Peter,
wonders and it's
like
like
Peter Noon from,
yeah,
yeah,
it's like 30 artists but the
right.
show is still only 2 hours long because they just kind of right they try it's almost
That's
like
right.
it's like a touring jukebox they kind of trot them out
because these songs are only 2 minutes long, if that,
yeah.
so,
Yeah, it's like it'll be like the Turtles, Lou Christie, and the Brooklyn Bridge, and like
whoever's still alive,
groups,
whoever's still around, right? We'll get them. We'll get them.
Yeah, yeah. If you can make money on it, you certainly can. So that was a great. Music wasn't as segmented yet, right? So that I think that's if we're going to put a check mark against the '60s, is that there was kind of British invasion, American pop, folk, and psychedelic music were probably the main. Again, I'm painting with a broad brush, but those were like the if you think about the '60s, those were like the main drivers.
Yeah,
British invasion music, American pop, folk music, and then psychedelic music, right? And we would see the splinters, but not really that much yet. It was kind of very much, and like I said before, even psychedelic music took off. It was pretty much just pop music.
Yeah.
There wasn't a lot of, there was experimentation in the studio, but the Beatles, for all the experimenting they were doing, the music was still relatively straightforward, until they got to Revolver. But pretty much the music scene there wasn't anything really crazy on the radio that you'd be like, wow, like, okay.
Right.
You would have to kind of seek it out on the albums. And yeah, there were, like the Beach Boys, prime example, for as much experimentation they were doing, you would never know it because it was still making pop music.
Yeah.
Right. It didn't sound like, to the untrained ear. It's like, okay, this is another Beach Boys song. Wouldn't it be nice? Sounds like Good Vibrations. Sounds like I Get Around. Sounds like Help Me Rhonda. Right. So to the, basically a lot of that stuff was kind of behind the scenes.
That's right.
Kind of innovations, right? Those were innovations that were happening kind of behind the scenes. The listening public was the benefactor, but probably not realizing it.
Yeah. And of course, like you say, behind the scenes, you had members of the band that were content to do just the pop stuff and just do the surf stuff. And that's what they were known for. And, and you find out that you have this savant in your midst who, frankly, they knew, might've been, had a little jealousy or envy came into play. So they start trying to do those things as well as Brian did, or, and sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't work, but but the point was that there was change happening. The influence was there. They felt they had to, keep up with the guy just to kind of,
Yeah, and other bands heard that, and other bands would use that as you
that's right.
read so many times. I heard just a random article. I heard about some artist from the '60s. I heard this song on the radio, and it inspired me to do something that might have been totally different, but that there was so much there was so much new stuff happening that you were kind of, all you had to do was listen to the radio to get ideas of what could be, and then kind of run it through your own filter and come out with something different, and that's probably where psychedelic music came from, was just kind of really kind of expanding the notion of what we can do. And that kind of leads us, I think psychedelic music, I think, is a good lead into the 70s.
Yeah.
Because I think when you think psychedelic music, you think groups like, obviously Jefferson Airplane, but you think like Pink Floyd.
Yeah, it was the birth of prog rock. It was sort of
which what I was getting to is in the 70s is really, if you want to think about it in Marvel terms, it was kind of like the multiverse, like the timelines started to branch in the 70s, because you had psychedelic music, which became a more improvisational, a long form kind of format of music without maybe any particular destination. It was more about the trip. It was more about the journey than the destination. And I think that's where prog kind of came, we started to see that in the 70s, that splintering. The 70s would be like the 20s if we're talking about a musical adult.
Mhm.
where you've been through your teens, you're kind of mature. It's like now you're becoming an adult, and what are you going to do with your knowledge?
Yeah.
And I think in the 70s we started to see that, right? All the experimentation was done. You know, the technology, the innovations had been made in the 60s, and then the 70s, I think, bore the fruits of
Yeah,
all
they
that
a
work.
lot of people, they grew as musicians, as, storytellers, because a lot of this
Yeah.
stuff was more that, they weren't real we were done talking about, the sign of the times kind of thing. We're taking you on a whole nother level, which we're gonna disappear into another world entirely and take you on
Yeah.
this weird trip, so that was I guess that was kind of the intent there for a lot of these bands. But also, like, we also didn't mention, like, from the 60s, that the people that went to see, like, the beatniks that went to see, like, jazz artists and things
Hmm.
like that, they would sort of cross over as well, wouldn't they? I mean,
Yeah.
people like Miles Davis he plugged in, started doing, like, the birth of something called jazz fusion, which, in a lot of ways, prog and jazz fusion kind of crossed over quite a
Yeah.
bit,
Absolutely.
because you
Absolutely.
had these virtuosic musicians all of a sudden working with one another, and they're really expanding, more of the music, as opposed to,
Lyrical
the
content.
lyrical
Yeah.
content, right? So
Yeah,
yeah,
no, absolutely. Yeah,
yeah,
that's where progressive rock came in, right? Because
yeah,
it was moving it forward, right? Progressing
yeah.
through these the format, and kind of
Hmm.
it became something that was more of an art form. Yeah,
Hmm.
less lyrical content, or lyrical heavy, as far as, I think the point of it was the musical journey that they would take you on, and it did have absolutely has its roots in jazz and in improvisational music.
Yeah, or even
You know, yeah, and
classical as
yeah,
well. Yeah.
classical as well.
Hmm.
And these groups, or these artists, or these young guys and gals with no discernible musical training as well, are playing this music, right?
Yeah, that blows my mind. I mean,
Kind of
guys like
picking up. Yeah, I picked. I started playing the piano when I was 12. I don't know how to read music, but just
18 years old, and they're doing,
uh,
holy shit, it's like, I can't
mm,
even play chopsticks on the piano, much less
yeah,
do the
yeah.
stuff
So
that they're, yeah, it's
yeah,
amazing.
it was absolutely amazing,
Yeah,
and so you start to see these threads that start getting pulled out of prog rock,
yeah,
and the singer songwriter movement, which we've talked about, right? That was a very important part of the 70s too. Is that almost like the flip side to prog? Is prog is big, boisterous, bombastic, and then the singer songwriters like James Taylor and Carole King and Linda Ronstadt and Carly
mhm,
Simon and Gordon Lightfoot, very introspective and very stripped down, and very much
minimalist,
about the
just
music, about the words, right? The music was the accompaniment. In prog, the lyrics are the accompaniment. The music was the point,
but
So
now,
so
instead of trying to be the voice of a generation, now we're just simply writing a love song.
yeah, tell us how you
Now
feel.
we're telling people how we feel internally,
Yeah,
right? It's not just politics, it's love, it's life, it's situations, it's, breakups, it's, all of this kind of stuff. James Taylor would, evoke that, and then so with Joni Mitchell and Carole King, especially. Yeah, so that like you said, like that minimalist approach just sort of took what they did in the folk era, and then but made it more, relatable, I guess, or more, heartfelt,
yeah,
wearing their heart on your
less
sleeve.
folky. There was something about folk music that just sounded. I don't want to use the word hokey, but you could tell it was folk music.
Yes,
In the
yes.
70s, it was something. It became something different.
Yeah, you couldn't
Um,
really define it. Like, what, it wasn't really
the
country.
Yeah,
It wasn't.
I think might be the arrangements.
Yeah, yeah. It's kind of like this kind of stuff you'd see on, like, a children's show
Yeah,
or
or
something.
like Kingston Trio, Peter, Paul, and Mary. It was kind
Right,
of like
right.
that.
Yeah,
The singer songwriters like Neil Diamond, they weren't. It wasn't like that in the 70s. It
yeah.
was something different to it. It had a different feel
Hmm.
to it. Might have been the production techniques, because in the 70s, like I said, all the experimenting was done in the 60s, and in the 70s, you really got just great sounding music. Like kind of the tools were learned, and it's
Oh
like
yeah,
they learned how to use these mixing boards, right, and how to
yeah.
really kind of understand the function of recording a guitar, recording a drum, and recording a bass. That you can record them all, but they also need different attention paid to them. And in the 70s, you really saw that. You really saw kind of producers kind of really, I think, come to the forefront of helping shape the sound of a group, of understanding, okay, yeah, we want to mic a guitar a certain way, or drums need to be mic'd different because they're too punchy and you can't use the same microphones. And I think in the 70s you had that maturing of the technique, right? And the refining of the technique, and the music just started to sound just fuller and richer. Even if it was a 4-piece band, it just had a nicer sound to it. The 60s could be a little crunchy, not abrasive, but in the 70s it kind of got smoothed out in a good way.
Well, stereo was most certainly the advent of stereo recording in the 70s. I mean, everything just sounded so much bigger and bolder and warmer, and you got to hear every instrument, right? When the 60s, something, a lot of stuff was in mono still. You're still getting that sort of like very cold, sort of in your face approach, and a lot of it, the fancy part about the recording might have been, oh, we're just putting a lot of reverb into it.
Yeah.
So you get that sort of echoey effect, but it's that is that considered to be a genius.
It dates it, yeah, but
it does date it. Yeah,
it absolutely dates
the 70s things were they knew how to tone that down and make a voice sound crystal clear and sort of like sort of more in the room a lot of times, but there was still a lot of that happening too. A lot of the grand, sort of voices and double tracking of voices and that kind of thing that really took off as well. I mean, you got singers that are doing 2-3 different vocal parts themselves, and then and then to bring in backup singers on top of that, and then so next thing you know, you have this sea of voices that are just make it sound so bold.
And I also think that the groups or the artists from the 60s that did transcend into the 70s got better at what they were doing as well, right? The Rolling Stones really kind of came into their own. They weren't just Beatles knockoffs. In the 70s, the Stones and the Who, Led Zeppelin, all these bands kind of came into their own and were carving out their own distinct niches, Lynyrd Skynyrd, Allman Brothers. So like we said, all these different genres start popping up, and you had leading edge artists that were defining each one of those niches and each one of those genres.
Yeah.
And David Bowie would kind of be the forerunner of like alternative music and kind of proto punk. So you had the splintering of music, kind of like almost like blasting wide open. And it was kind of like anything goes in the 70s. That's really what it was. It was, fueled by drugs and fueled by all that, fueled by excess. But that was what it was. Is kind of anything went through anything against the wall. The advent of the synthesizer, right, that's really what drove prog rock in the 70s. Was, they weren't playing pianos. They were playing all these groups from Yes to Styx to ELP to whoever, all were playing synthesizer. The birth of the synthesizer and the advent of the synthesizer in the 70s really also helped define the shape of that music, and that was in pop music as well.
And of course that would carry over into the next decade, in which that became even bigger and broader. And they did,
we'll get to that. There's a particular particular instrument that really came. And then also, as far as guitar players, if in the 60s, it wasn't a lot of effects, pretty much, there was really kind of some distortion, not a whole lot of craziness. But then in the 70s, you really started to see echo, chorus, the talk box, right? That Joe Walsh and Peter Frampton, like Show Me the Way,
slide,
and the slide guitar,
the whammy bar,
Rocky Mountain Way with kind of, really innovating the guitar sound as well. So you got synthesizer, which kind of revolutionized the keyboard. But then you've got artists in the 70s that were really kind of taking the guitar also to the next level. Because again, the 60s was kind of learning the tools, and that was learning the instruments as well. In the wake of Hendrix.
Yeah, I would imagine a bigger challenge for people having to set this shit up on stage, right? These massive rigs that, all these pedals and, that these guitar players are using, the sort of the wah-wah, the flange, the this, the that, like all these
Yeah,
different
and he
effects and,
sounding unique,
yeah,
Jimmy Page had his own sound, Townsend had his own sound.
right.
Each one of these artists kind of, taking their instrument and putting their own stamp on it in the 70s. Brian May had a particular sound. Clapton, you could pick Clapton out, his Fender has a sound, and in the 70s all these artists kind of notched out their, kind of, got their little square acre of land of
That's true.
this is where I'm laying down my roots
I
is
That's
and
absolutely,
I've got to, this is my sound.
there's a lot of truth in that. And because, and you feel like the further you go back there, like you were saying, there was fewer artists to pick out that were
Mm-hmm.
doing this stuff. So they literally did have their own identity, right? They had, like, nobody really sounded like the Who at the
Yeah.
time, or nobody really sounded like the Stones or Zeppelin. People were trying to, I guess, trying to go there. Some bands were, but that, I feel that came a little bit later, but like
Mm-hmm.
in the early '70s, they very distinct, just sort of
Yeah.
little pockets of bands that were just doing their own thing. And then you realize, even if you go further back to the '60s, there weren't a lot of guitar players plugging in. I mean, there was a lot of rhythm guitar being played.
Yeah.
The,
Yeah. It wasn't a thing.
those innovative guitar play, those lead guitar players, they're very few. They, and those are the guys that really stood out. But
Yeah.
unfortunately, there's some of them that are the most unsung as well. A lot of people don't realize that there's a lot of, even in the '50s, there were people that were doing that, but not, people weren't really looking that far back,
Yeah.
which is a shame. But but on the other hand, it's like, but now you have this. So now more and more people want to do what they're doing. So that you started to see the growth of these rock bands that are just coming in and
Yeah,
and,
it
and
was like it just kind of, it was almost like mushrooms in a field. Like they were, and the great thing about it
yeah.
was the record companies really gave these groups had contracts. Like they had like long, like the thing about the 70s is these groups put out, there were groups that would put out album after album that would just not go anywhere. Then 6 albums in, they would strike it.
Yeah.
I don't think I don't think you see that today. So in the 70s, you also had artists had a chance to kind of mature and develop and kind of figure things out, and the record company would just kind of keep making, yeah, we'll keep, how many groups did that you see that some of the early albums is like, well, okay, there's not a hit until like the third, fourth, or fifth album,
Yeah.
and it's
Yeah.
like, what was going on before that? Nowadays, that won't last too long,
No.
unless you're, and so I think the groups
people
also had
people,
the ability to kind of mature.
yeah,
And
people
grow.
had, yeah, absolutely. People had time to develop their sound.
Yeah,
And record companies,
and they were prolific too. These artists.
some of these record executives understood that, though.
Yeah.
If you were lucky to get those kinds of executives who knew music, they understood that they needed to find their way, to find their niche. Unfortunately, there's a lot of executives that don't know shit about music.
Hopefully the good ones saw it as an investment,
Right.
that
Right.
hopefully will pay off, and kind of that really kind of helped those artists kind of develop. And then you also had, in the 70s, you also have this later in the decade, another genre pops up called disco,
Yep.
which totally takes the world by storm, America by storm, totally takes music and kind of tips it over.
Mm-hmm.
It went from just kind of, rock and roll and kind of pop music, and then all of a sudden disco just kind of comes in late in the game and totally transforms the landscape of music again. You can't, for me, when I think about the 70s, what I think is most kind of what comes to the forefront of my mind is AM radio.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Because AM radio in the 70s was the great melting pot. That's where you would put on AM radio and you would hear everything. You would hear a country artist, then you would hear a soul artist, then you would hear like a rock song, then you'd hear like a bubblegum pop song, like this,
Yeah.
and you hear a novelty song like The Streak, and then you'd hear, another soul song. And
Mm-hmm.
it was, AM radio kind of didn't discriminate. It played everything.
Yeah.
And that was the great thing about listening to radio back then is you weren't really picking and choosing. It was just kind of, everything was just mute. It was all music.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't like, here's a country song. They would just play. If there was a country song that was popular, it would be played on AM radio. And then if there was a rock song that was popular, it would be played right after it. And then
Yeah.
if there was a weird, disco duck, then it would be played right after it. So you would just hear just like everything, and for me, I think the advent of AM radio in the 70s, I think really kind of helped a lot of people that grew up in that era connect to music. Because
I think so.
you were exposed to so much more stuff than you realize. When I think about it now, I'm like, oh my God, there was so much different music that I was aware of.
At least
Not knowing it was a genre, not knowing it was this or that. It was just music that was played.
No, I totally, yeah, I agree with that. And it's, but to me, it felt more, it was at least an open door, right? It was not, we're not talking, I mean, unfortunately, there was still a lot of that happening. There was still a lot of like, sort of divide. Black artists weren't being played on the radio as much, but like, I guess the people of real value at that point, like the jazz artists and things, you didn't hear that, but you heard a pop version of that, like a lighter version of
Mhm.
jazz, like a light jazz, or at least that, that they were walking through that threshold of at least introducing a different sound
Yeah.
to people at that point, especially young kids like us who were very impressionable and like, wow, that's different.
Yeah, if it caught on, they played it.
That's right. And then, you would look into that kind of thing, and then that's how you dive deep, and that's where you find,
or you just file it away and be like, oh wow.
Right.
And then years later you hear it like, oh wow, that was really kind of a
right,
really lush song to be popular, or this person
That's
was
right.
like in their 40s when they had this hit in the 70s. And and you don't kind of see that diversity even in the age spectrum nowadays. That was what I loved about it. It was you heard everything and anything. If it didn't make a difference, if Frank Sinatra had a hit and he was in his 60s, it was on AM radio, and then right after that you'd hear Donna Summer or whatever it was. It was just a great.
That's true.
It was a kind of a patchwork quilt of just all different types of music that you would just listen to. I don't even think oldies radio today even replicates it as much. They try to, but it was just anything and everything. And you just heard, and you didn't realize you were getting a musical education. So I think AM radio in the 70s was a big part of that,
especially in like the spring and the summer months too. Like, right. I mean, God, I'm thinking of like Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, with that kind of that situation really grabbed me, with Brad Pitt driving around in the car, and you hear like him listening to the radio, I forget the guy's name, Don Steele, but this is Don Steele, but this was L.A., but we had our own
Cousin Brucey.
Yeah, that's right. What was it?
WABC.
ABC. Yeah. And
Victor Tomorrow.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
All the great ones,
but like you say, like all this, and the way the songs just ran right into each other, right? I love that. It's like, and you hear one hit right after another, and it was just very entertaining.
Yeah, it was just a pastiche of music of all just different things. And you, like I said, you weren't really sitting there separating it out. It was
I would.
It was just popular music. It was just
often
music.
Have to go with my parents to shopping on a weekend or something. In
and
the
they'd
car.
have it on too. Yeah,
that's right. And I would want to sit in the car because I'd want to listen to the radio. I didn't want to go into the store. I want to listen to music. Right. That was we can't leave the car on. It's a gas shortage.
Yeah, that's right. And then you had to get gas. Depending on your license plate number, you had to go on even or odd days.
Yeah, that's right.
When it got really bad, if you had the gas situation got so bad in the 70s that they had to ration out the gas, so they would go by license plate number. So if your license plate ended in an odd number, you can go on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and if it was an even number, you can go Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, or whatever. It was crazy, and the lines were long.
Of course, we didn't have Walkmans or anything back in the day. No. We didn't have that stuff yet. So
no, just the transistor radio was it.
Radio was the thing. Yep.
Yeah, transistor radio was the thing you could have in your room, and it didn't cost anything. You had batteries. You didn't have to buy stuff, and it was a literally a global jukebox. They played everything. If you're in the right market, I suppose. Where we were lucky to be in the New York market, where it was vibrant and they played all this stuff.
New York was sure. Yeah.
And then, like I said, towards the end of the 70s, you would get disco and you would get punk also, which would kind of spark a whole other revolution. But I think disco really kind of overtook it, became so big, and then had such a big backlash as well. Like
It did.
for everything was disco, and then everyone was like, "I'm tired of this." Like
It did.
kind of
It totally did.
it flamed out pretty quick. But
it wore out its I mean, I wouldn't say wore out its welcome, because I loved it. I wanted more. And it obviously has its roots in like funk and R&B, which kind of turned into something. Just add a little bit of pop flavoring to that. Now you got some really great
even jazz with these long form disco songs. That you've got. It's about the music. Yeah, it's about the musicianship. It was about keeping people on the floor.
And I think that at this point it was okay. We're going to kill prog rock. This long haired stuff is out. Now it's time for.
You're going to make long form music, but you're going to want to move to it. You're not going to want to trip. You're not going to want to trip to it.
It's either that or punk rock. Punk rock came in and was out. Totally out to destroy
everything.
Exactly. Even what people like Zeppelin were doing. Like we want, this is raw.
Just thumbing their nose at everything.
We don't even have to be good for people to relate to this. This is the point of punk rock. We want,
attitude.
The attitude, which, of course, at the time, I was like, I wanted things to sound good, right? Because we were so used to that. I suppose, growing up,
it was jarring.
Very impressionable to hear something so
threatening
ugly.
Threatening.
And just like this sucks. It's just noise. You could say that, but you understand now. You appreciate what it was and why, and so
and those two art forms will take us into the 80s because disco would splinter off into another subgenre of rap.
Yeah,
and punk for all intents and purposes would splinter off into new wave music.
Yeah,
which would usher in the final decade that we're going to talk about, which is the 80s. And it was kind of the dawning of a new era.
Which to me was like punk rock. Punk rock was like fuck you to prog, fuck you to this stuff. And then you had
everything,
right? But then it had. The new wave comes in, and so now you're starting to bring that stuff back. Now you're starting to bring this sort of artsy. It's still punk. It's still short. It was
a reset. Yeah, it was like a reset.
But you got like people like Talking Heads that were like it was relatable and it was funky. It was like, but they were doing more than just playing three chords. Like people like the Clash were doing that, playing reggae. The Police, they were doing something above and beyond just And that to me is progressive. I think I mentioned Stuart Copeland even said that. He's like, we wanted to be a punk band, but we ended up being more than that. So I considered the Police a prog band more or less because we ended up doing more on record.
Yeah, taking those things and expanding it. Like I said, it was kind of punk was kind of a reset, as it were, for music of kind of. And with the fall of disco, it kind of like the 80s were kind of a wasteland because a lot of the artists from the 70s, really didn't transition well. So it was kind of an opportunity for new or the next generation of artists to kind of come to the forefront.
Yeah.
And on top of that was, there was a digital revolution, kind of digital recording, but digital instrumentation.
Yeah, the tools
right
of the
made
day.
it made it easier, for better or for worse. The Fairlight computer, which was invented in 79, but the Fairlight computer would be used extensively in the 80s because what you could do is you could record a drum, put it into the computer, and then replicate that sound over and over, and with different types of tones and different kind of tunings.
This was the proto Pro Tools, right?
Yeah.
I mean, this was.
It was the great experimenter. Peter Gabriel used it in the song San Jacinto.
Yeah,
he used a Fairlight there to sample a marimba. Relax by Frankie Goes to Hollywood. Heavily, the drums on there were used as a Fairlight. The album Hysteria, 1987. From Def Leppard. After Rick Allen had, drummer Rick Allen had a car accident. He lost his left arm. They weren't sure what they were going to do.
They had to supplement.
They had to supplement that. So they used the Fairlight computer to sample drums and help lay them over. So using of technology kind of uh, became a way also for people to express their art in a different way. So you didn't have to be a virtuoso guitar player.
Yeah.
If you knew how to use the technology, someone like Thomas Dolby or Trevor Horn, these
Yes.
guys became enthusiasts and experts at using the technology to create music. So we saw something different. If the 70s were more of an acoustic and a wooden decade,
Hmm.
the 80s were definitely more the digital and electronic.
And
And
it
again, for
was
better or for worse.
well, expanding the multimedia thing too. Of
Yeah.
course, MTV video became a thing. Sight, image became a big part of the music scene, which a lot of artists that especially the artists that kind of carried over from the
Mm-hmm.
70s who was still recording new music, which that in itself was a little bit jarring to hear these guys, like people like Don Henley, for example, using synthesizers on Building the Perfect Beast, or like Dirty Laundry,
Yeah, or Sunset Grill and
Sunset
songs like that.
Grill, and it's like, yeah, this guy from Eagles, right? It's an acoustic band, more or less. They're just guitars and vocals, and he's using like these weird sounds, and it was so bizarre.
Yeah,
And that's
that was what you had to do, though, right? That was
it was
at
what
the
they
time,
had to
that was
do, but
the
unfortunately,
leading
to me,
edge.
it's the most. It unfortunately dates it
Yeah,
in such a way, but it is fun to look back at this stuff and just sort of.
yeah,
But you mentioned a few names there, Dolby and Horn, but they were the innovators. They were the guys who were using the technology. Peter Gabriel as well.
Mhm.
Daniel Lanois, his production sense had a lot of that sort of texturally, kind of stuff going on as well. Bringing back the multi-tracking different brass and making and cymbals and things, and just sort of you know kind of opening up the playing field, but also using a lot of that electronic stuff as well. Sort of like the warbling effect and all that kind of stuff going on. And
yeah. Courtesy of a little keyboard called the DX7
the
from
roll.
Yamaha, which became like the DX7 became like the de facto keyboard for anybody to use in the 80s, because it was so versatile. It could do almost anything. It could replicate almost any sound.
Yeah.
That if you weren't into the Fairlight, which was primitive technology, I mean, you had to put things on floppy disks. I mean, it really was a bear to use. You could get the DX7 and kind of, songs like Take on Me from Aha is a DX7 delight. Eyes Without a Face by Billy Idol and Take My Breath Away by Berlin. Those are all like, that's the DX7. That became like the sound of the 80s, was this keyboard that could replicate big sweeping strings, or it could have the synthy sound to it as well. And, or it could replicate a grand piano or electric piano like Take on Me. So you really saw bands that kind of flourished that may not, maybe didn't have as much technical prowess on the instruments, able to create music. So kind of opened it up in that way.
And again, like we mentioned, bands from the 70s having their own niche, their own thing, right? These artists were very much that time. This is what they did. This is the music they did, and I applaud that. But it's like I said, that when other artists who really didn't belong, just didn't quite fit when they were trying to use the stuff, and not very well, I might add. They just had to fit in.
Yeah. Well, it was another decade of experimentation, right?
These people were doing it and creating with it. They weren't like just using it as the
shoehorning. Some artists were shoehorning it in.
We can't use a real guitar. We can simulate a guitar. We won't use real drum. We don't need a drummer. We'll just use
we'll use the pads.
We'll use the pads and the drum machines. All that kind of stuff. And it's like So there's that fine line of innovation and just using it because
it was there. Yeah, like
you had to adapt.
Everybody was. Yeah.
You didn't know how to adapt in that sense. So
again, because it was kind of a new. The ways of the 70s were being replaced by doing things digitally, starting to use a computer to record things or to sample,
right,
and not having to play it, right, and the technology hadn't been so refined yet. You could tell that the keyboard didn't sound like a violin It kind of sounded like strings, but it didn't
Yeah.
really. So it kind of, the technology still wasn't quite there in the 80s, but it was enough that it was something different.
Horns
Right?
were also a big,
yeah.
that's sort of like, like
Yeah,
brassy horns, like,
you could
just
tell it wasn't, because
no.
you're playing individual notes, but it was a new thing, and it was kind of like, oh, here, this is now cutting edge. That was cutting edge at the time.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right. That was the difference. Is now it sounds dated, and it sounds, most definitely 80s.
Mm-hmm.
But at the time, it was cutting edge technology. Right. We're replacing a guitar. We don't need to hire 5 violinists. We can do it with a keyboard instead.
Yeah.
So at the time, it was kind of a reset of, okay, here's new innovations. We need to learn how to use it.
It was the future.
Yeah, supposedly. I think of bands like Eurythmics who did it the right way.
Absolutely.
They used sampling, they used drum
Dave
machines,
Stewart.
they used looping and sequencing, but it was, they were creating something new out of it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It was something different. I remember when I first heard Sweet Dreams, I was like, what is this? This is kind of weird. I didn't know what to make of it. But now when you look back on it, it was kind of like a watershed moment. It was like, wow, this is something.
It's amazing. Yeah. The video also added something to it as well. Like
the visuals,
the visual aspect of it.
That heralded like the second British invasion, right?
That's what Tom Petty might be he might be one of the few artists that kind of slid by and actually did something when he
got away with it.
Dave Stewart with "Don't Come Around Here No More," which is by far and away one of my favorite songs by Petty. I love that song. It's just so odd and so and it's effective. And he knew, he had the instinct of well,
it was just sprinkling.
Yeah.
It wasn't like, oh, we're going to make all of a sudden Tom Petty.
Well, for the most part, the song was that, and then it kicks into the rock thing at the very end.
But the whole album wasn't like that either. So it was kind of we're going to dabble in it, right, and not say, oh, we're going to totally change our. Now we're a new wave band.
Yeah,
like they didn't totally.
No,
right? Then Montench all of a sudden wasn't playing synthesizers. It was. To your point, used in the right way it wasn't shoehorned in of, oh, we're going to put these synthesizers in, how are we going to fit them in?
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like, how can we do this, but still sound like us?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And that's a legacy artist or an artist from the 70s using it in the right way. Yeah. But that second British invasion, I think, also kind of gave us another smattering and another helping of pop music that was so gret. Think of artists like Lisa Stansfield. The Blue-Eyed Soul kind of thing came back with "Been Around the World" and Fine Young Cannibals and all these great British artists that kind of took advantage again of that digital revolution, and Flock of Seagulls. It just seems like it was like the 60s all over again. Like American artists it was hard pressed. I mean, there was some great ones like Huey Lewis and the News and Bob Seger, they were still there, but it seemed like Duran Duran, like these British artists would, Def Leppard assaulted the United States shores with 2 albums in a row in the 80s,
Depeche Mode. You had the Smiths.
Culture Club. I mean, they couldn't miss hit after hit after hit.
The Fix, and also, right?
This was a great. There was all this kind of new wave
talk.
And it would kind of morph into alternative, right? Because so another in the 80s, it was kind of like new wave kind of started out the 80s, and then that kind of morphed. Rock and roll became kind of metal and hair metal. That kind of light music, for better or for worse. That was you can't discount what was going on.
I think that's
with
what they refer to as glam metal. Glam
metal. And then alternative was kind of springing up in college radio stations, of playing stuff that wasn't that. It was the antidote to that these small radio stations and colleges didn't want to play Poison and Motley Crue and
which was stuff like at the time that was the most popular form of music when that stuff was prominent. I think that was the best selling. It was the most popular. It was like the most played, the most, the glam metal, which was like, that was surprising to me. I was like, wow.
Yeah. Well, a lot of the dance stuff too, a lot of that freestyle, like Taylor Dane was coming into popularity.
You still had your R&B
Debbie Gibson and that kind of pop music was Paula Abdul. All that stuff was kind of dominating the charts as well. So there was there was room for that. They were kind of keeping the pop spirit alive, but on the sidelines was this alternative music. and kind of, the glam metal was kind of becoming popular on MTV because, like you said, it was very visual.
There's always something.
Seeing these guys with makeup on and teased hair and Aquanet, it became a very visual thing for those bands. Whereas
there's always bands that you're going to find that we probably don't even know that came out of the 80s, and that's supposed to be technically our decade. That was our sort of coming of age decade, right? Because we were old enough to, we were still getting into the bands from the 70s, but but it's like the 80s became like, but I know that there's probably bands that I've never heard that are probably like, oh, that's nothing compared to these guys. There's always some underground thing happening. I think in every decade that there's always a band that somebody's going to point out that, oh, you never heard anything until you heard these guys. And I'm like,
oh, of course, there's plenty of unsung,
you know what I mean? Like,
unsung heroes. And that's why we go back, hopefully.
I guess I'm making that point because I tend to be a little harsh talking about the 80s, but then I realized that there was a lot of some like really innovative stuff happening, So
you have to take
give it credit,
you have to put yourself in the mindset.
Yeah.
Yeah. You can't look at the 80s. If you look at the 80s from an outside looking in perspective, it's not going to work. Because all you're going to think about is neon and teased hair and rubber gasket bracelets and Madonna lace. Like you're going to think about all the kitsch, if you look at it from the outside looking in. But if you kind of go back and try and immerse yourself into and put yourself in the mindset of what was going on at the time, and try to remember that this stuff was cutting edge, and you have to kind of put it, whether or not it's aged, and whether or not things got better or worse at that time. There was a lot going on. Michael Jackson's Thriller, the biggest selling album of all time, came out in the 80s.
Madonna,
what does that mean, right? Madonna changed the face of music forever.
Prince
in the 80s, and all these artists, right? There was a lot going on there. It's just
he was a guy that I totally underappreciated at the time. I should have been listening to Prince at the time because he was brilliant. Yeah. Now I'm going back and I'm like, I it's one of my biggest regrets is not.
But he's from the 80s. It was mainly from the 80s. So
kind of passed me by. It's the image that kind of threw you.
So how do you reconcile that,
this
right?
This guy isn't the new Hendrix. Like he's not a guitar player. I see a lot of dancing. That's the sort of the thing that you get. But then you realize this guy played everything. He did everything. He was eccentric, but he was.
Yeah, you have your preconceived notions, and I think when you think when we talk about the 80s, I think we need to take the nostalgia kitsch out of it, of how people look at the 80s now, right? Because that's the thing is that stuff is looked upon nostalgically, but not very realistically. It's drawn very broadly, and
I think you could say
and everybody was this. But
you could say the same of the 70s, and of course,
everything was hippie, but I think less so. I think it's it's easier to kind of look at the depth of the music in the 70s, and it's easy to dismiss the 80s if you're going by the same checklist.
I get it.
And I think if you spend time in an 80s like playlist of just all types of music, I think if you kind of re-immerse yourself in there and then be like, okay, I remember, just the 70s had its share of corny and cheesy pop, but it was all, again, when you put it in its place at the time, it fit. Everything was happy, and people were, there's still the leftovers of the hippie generation, and pop music had really was kind of happy stuff.
Yeah.
The 80s was more kitschy, but at the time it wasn't, because it was just what was going on. Right. It was just like we felt we were on the edge of.
Well, like I said, it was something, like I said, it was sort of like embracing the future. Yeah. And there was a time of great excess, of great promise.
Yeah, that too.
Right. It was like, oh, the 80s are going to be bright, and, the future is going to be,
future is going to be neon.
And we got all this technology and all this stuff is, whatever.
Yeah, the computer revolution, all that,
video
all that
games
stuff was going on at the same time. Yeah,
it
was like the dawning of the digital era, right? And that's really what it was. And the music the music represented that, or it represented what people thought that era would be, what the digital revolution would
And
be.
not only
So
that, it was the advent of, watching movies at home, right?
yeah, that's
VCRs
true.
came into, we could actually watch we don't have to go to the theater. We could watch a movie and we could buy a movie. We could rent it. CDs became a thing.
You
It
could
was a,
record your soap opera and watch it later.
that's right.
I don't know why.
And
Just watch it when it's on.
manipulate the movie as you're watching. We can rewind it and go
Yeah,
back and
there you
see
go.
that scene again. And,
All
I
the
mean,
stuff, all the stuff you could have done with music already. That cassettes were already doing it, right? We were
Yeah.
already manipulating music in the 80s and
Oh, yeah.
making our own taste and all that kind of stuff. So, all right, so I think we've kind of hit the high points. This wasn't supposed to be all encompassing.
Mhm.
But I think I think we hit some of the high points. If we forgot anything, let us know. Hit us up on Facebook and Instagram. Let us know what we missed or what's a high watermark for you.
Mhm.
Now I'm going to ask Eric. I think this is where the rubber meets the road. What's so funny? What's so funny?
Oh, these sayings. You're just gonna...
What? It's not. It's
Where
not.
the hell did you pull? Where'd you pull that one out of?
It's not an uncommon saying. Look that up. Where the rubber meets the road. That's
I've never heard that expression. Never.
What?
I have never heard that.
On social media, let me know. How many of you have heard this when the term "this is where the rubber meets the road"?
I have never heard that.
That is an old timey saying. Please back me up on social media. Let me know.
I'm not saying it's a bad saying. It's just funny,
It's old timey.
Okay.
So what do you think? The 60s, the 70s, or the 80s? Pound for pound, for you, which decade? We're not carving this in stone,
Mm-hmm.
so don't worry. We're not gonna hold you to it and say, well, you said this, and it's a hard choice because we took three of these are the three prime decades of music, really. Like I said, if you look at this as a child, you're taking teenage years, you're taking adulthood, and then you're taking someone in their 30s when they're kind of,
it's so many factors.
They're growing and they're matured. And there are so many factors. So pound for pound, if you were going to choose a decade and this is, pretty much all you were going to listen to.
Okay.
Not forever, but this would be the primary, if you signed up for Spotify and they're like, well, we need to know which decade is it, so we can tailor everything to you and give you the best musical experience. Which one are you going to choose?
I'm gonna have to go with the 70s, because
70s.
I think I might have mentioned this. It's either I don't know if we talked. I know we talked about it at some point, but I don't know if we actually mentioned it on the air. But for me, it's not even a question of, if you really want to get down to it. I mean, for me, the best 10 years of music was like 66 to 76 for me.
That's not what we're asking.
That's not what we're asking. I know I'm breaking the rules. But 70s, I'm going to have to go with the 60s. Because everything that sort of started in the 60s carried over into the 70s.
Okay.
It was bigger. It was broader. There was, to me, there just seemed to be a lot more to choose from. Just, genre-wise, there's just a lot more to, and there's still bands that I'm discovering. And
let me ask you a question about that, about your choice.
Yeah.
You just said there was a lot more to choose from.
Yeah.
Are you saying that? Are you saying that now in hindsight, or are you saying that based on your experience then?
I think I didn't know it then. Growing up in the 80s, I didn't realize that there was so much. But I think over time, as time went on, I realized that there were bands just, starting it all, innovating, and now like I said, like a lot of bands, I have nothing against new music. I whatever, but I just feel like there's a repetitive thing. The 90s brought grunge back, and what to me was like a return to the classic rock era of the 70s, of that warm rock, gritty, raw rock and roll sound that that started then. So yeah, that it to me, it feels the best to me. I'm probably a little bit more nostalgic for it.
Mhm.
The music just affects me in a way. But then there's also the, that aspect of it, of where it all came from and where it started, at least in my lifetime.
Sure.
You know what I mean? So, I mean, obviously, I'm sure there's people that, oh, well, it started in the 30s and the
No,
40s. We could,
of
everybody
course.
has their,
Those people are long gone. They're dead. We don't have to worry about
wow.
them. They're dead. Their spirit is
They
dead.
are,
That one.
Jesus Christ.
You're building a rat ship here. Sorry, I just broke out into sentimental.
Oh my goodness. But yeah, but for
Uh,
me, it's the most, for me, it's the most treasured decade. There's so much
Good.
there. There's so much innovation there, but it's enjoyable. It's,
Okay.
so yeah, what about you?
All right. What about me?
Yeah.
Oh, thanks for asking.
Yeah.
Pound for pound, right? It's hard. It's hard to pick one without, because you're basically, I'm going to use harsh words. You're basically discounting 2 other decades, right? You're basically kind of
It
crossing
is
them off, right?
very,
So it's
very
very
difficult.
hard.
Yeah.
And each one had its, there was special things that happened in each decade that are
Yeah.
watershed moments in music. Pound for pound, I have to go with the 70s as well.
Okay.
It's the thing that I think of, or the 2 words that come to mind for the 70s was anything goes.
Yeah.
Meaning labels were open to any type of music, of recording any type of artist. So many artists, you look through, or I'll look through like auctions, online auctions for albums and stuff from the 70s. But I've never even heard of these people, like one-off guy, or he made one album or whatever.
Yeah.
I think there was that, and there was that, like I said, the maturing of rock and roll. So the learning was done in the 60s, and I think the 70s bore the fruits of that. Billy Joel, Elton John, all these great artists, Foreigner, Boston, just all different genres. Like I said, disco, soul music was really, Gladys Knight and the Pips, Stevie Wonder, the stuff he was doing in the 70s.
Yep.
Just there's so much we didn't go over, but and I think where my musical education came from was the 70s.
Yeah.
I went back to the 60s, right? I wasn't coherent.
Yeah, I mean, the stuff
for the 60s. So
the stuff that seemed as old. I mean, you realize that even like the turn of the decade of 80, 81, the Who just finished. The Led Zeppelin just made their last album then. Like 79 was their last.
I still didn't realize that. But when you think about it, it's like, this stuff was still there. It was still happening.
It was still fresh. It was very
those
fresh,
those were new bands.
Yeah. It's true. It's true.
So I think for the breadth of music, the scope of music, and all the things that happened, including disco, like that was an important part, and
punk.
all of that, and punk, all that stuff kind of made up a very eclectic decade. Steely Dan, right? The jazz influenced stuff that I wasn't into maybe then, but like you said, some of it was experienced then. A lot of it was the pop music. And then after the fact, realizing that all these bands were kind of occupying the same space,
and let's not
space and time.
And let's not forget all the one-hit wonders.
Yeah, that was the thing. That was AM radio was like
the yacht rock, right? There's a great documentary on Paramount Plus called "Sometimes When We Touch," and it's all about the yacht rock, or the
Sometimes
light
When
rock.
We Touch, Dan Hill.
Yeah.
See, I'll tell you, Rupert Holmes, the Pina Colada
Captain and
song.
Tennille, the Carpenters, all these like they're talking.
Come and Get Your Love. I mean, the 70s were I mean, the 60s were as much too, but the 70s, everybody had an opportunity.
And this stuff was hokey. Some of it was hokey, some of it was, but some of it just sounded good, man. It was just, that's what really. I mean, it's a feeling too. Like it's the how it makes you feel.
I think that's what it was too. Is the music just. We lament it all the time in the 80s because we're looking back at it.
Yeah.
And we're saying how artificial it sounds and how it, has that sheen over it. We never really say that about the 70s. The 70s had something different to it. You'll call it a warmth. is probably one of your favorite terms,
Mhm.
which it did. There was some, school was out, the 60s was school, and school was out, and the 70s was kind of, okay, let's, we learned everything, and now we're going to put it into practice, and
Mhm.
everybody, any crazy idea for a genre of music had a seat at the table, and that was the great thing about it. It was just
Mhm.
kind of everything was there for you to listen to. So yeah, so I don't think it was going to be any surprise. I knew you were
No.
going to say the 70s.
Yeah. I mean, yeah.
I
And
knew
we're
you were
not,
going to.
and folks, we're not trying to say that, we're not trying to like, oh, we're saying, well, this is like for us, that's how we feel. Everybody is
Yeah,
different. Everybody has their decade. Everybody has
yeah,
their, music that they came
connect
to
to.
know, connected
Yeah,
to. And
yeah, and they're just
so
wrong. They're just wrong.
yeah.
So it's okay. It's okay to be wrong. It's fine.
Okay. Okay. You said that, I didn't. So you'll take the heat.
No, it's fine. No, I mean, I could, 60s would be a second,
Uh-huh.
because there's a lot of, but if we had to choose, and this is just, like I said, this is like a what if episode and just having a discussion. So let us know what one you think it is the 70s, or why not the 70s? Why the 80s? Were the 80s, again, and like Eric said, it's conditional.
Yeah.
If you grew up in the 80s and you were listening to PLJ and Z100 in the 80s and came, that's going to be, maybe it is because of the connection.
Yeah.
Right. What you were weaned on.
That's right.
Right. It could be.
I'm kind of in between. My older brother, like his decade was the 70s, right? So, but yet I feel like he always accused me of being 10 years behind the times. And I don't care.
We could claim the 70s just as easy. We were teenagers.
The 80s too. We embraced it all as it was coming out.
Yeah.
But to me, it just had a very,
Yeah.
the innovations of the day where it was very jarring. And I think that was it. It was.
Yeah.
We loved the cool, the fact that this technology was happening, but if I listened to a song, it didn't quite affect me the same way
something was different. Yeah.
Something was different. Yeah.
So let's get into it. Hit us up on social media. Let us know. 60s, 70s, or 80s, or is there another decade that you would like to advocate for? Maybe we didn't even get the right 3 in your list. So hit us up on social media. Let us know. Also, visit us on YouTube. We've got video versions of this, and you're looking at me right now, and you'll probably be seeing this at some point. So go ahead and like and subscribe. Do that for us as well. That keeps the videos coming on YouTube, which is a lot of fun as well. Put a sign on the background. And that's going to do it for this lively but really fun discussion, and a little technical, little bit of everything in this one, which is a lot of fun to do, of the best decade for music. We think is unanimous. It's only 2 people, but it's unanimous. 2 people make the majority. It is the 70s.
Yep.
And so for Eric, this has been Dean. We will see you on the flip side.
You've been listening to the 3324 podcast with Dean Legiro and Eric Kuber. You can find us on your favorite podcast provider, so please like, subscribe, and rate to become a part of the 3324 family. Your feedback is important, so make sure to follow us on Instagram and Facebook at 3324 podcast and on Twitter at 3324p to join the conversation.